Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to talk about the almost best books of 2022. In case you're wondering what that is, I have already done a video about the best fiction books and the best non-fiction books of 2022. I'll link both of those videos in the description box down below. This is for the also-rans, the books that I really liked but that didn't crack into that list. The ones that I want to give a special shout out to, maybe call them the honorable mentions if you will, but they are books that I really liked but did not make it into the ultimate best list. I still thought they were worth shouting out. I did a version of this last year, and I think even the year before. I'll link the one for last year down below if you'd like to go back in time and check that one out as well. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. After this video, I think we're going to be done with best and worst recaps. I'll put my worst video down below as well. And then we are going to start moving into just a little bit more of like a 2022 recap. I'll talk about how I did with my reading intentions and goals and things like that. And we'll start talking about plans for 2023. That's where we're going to go after this video. But we got to start here. And these are going to be presented in no particular order. They are just books that I enjoyed, and we'll go through them. The first one is Holding by Graham Norton. This is something I read way back in January of 2022, a year ago at this point. It was one of the first books that I read in 2022. And I enjoyed it. I want to read more of Graham Norton's mysteries. This is a sort of smart, cleverly constructed mystery, but it's more about the people than it is about the mystery. I honestly barely even remember what the mystery was about, but I do remember the characters. And because of that, I enjoyed the book, and I would like to read more of his books in the future. It felt like a cozy mystery without being cozy, or like having the things about a cozy mystery that often feel silly or make you feel like you should feel guilty for what you were reading, like that kind of low calorie feel. Because it goes in so hard on the personal relationships and all of that. So I don't really quite remember the mystery, but it's set in a small town in Ireland, and it is there's a body is found, and people assume it relates to a sort of missing person case. But again, it's much more about the characters. It is slyly funny in a lot of ways. If you know Graham Norton, that's not really a surprise. But I liked the book a lot. It just didn't make it into my favorites. I feel like honorable mention feels about right for this one. The next one is Kiss Her Once for Me by Alison Cochrun, which was sort of the LGBTQ romance I really needed at the time that I read it. I had advanced access to an e-galley of it, and I read it over the summer when things were really heavy. We were going through some heavy grief because we had lost the dog, and I was trying to pull myself out of that, and this really did a lot to help me on that process. And I loved it. I'm a fan of The Charm Offensive, which is the other book Alison Cochrun has written, which is also an LGBTQ romance. And this one is holiday themed, which is kind of my thing. I love a holiday themed queer romance. It just makes me happy. So in this one, you have two women who meet one Christmas, and they have a meet cute in Powell's, which is sort of hyped up in the book, and then it ends up not being a big part of the book. It is teased out in flashbacks, but I kind of expected a bookstore romance from that, and it's not really what that is at all. And they have this great night together, and at the end of it, there's a misunderstanding, and they separate and don't see each other for the next year, and things don't go great for the protagonist. Over the next year, she ends up in a situation where she agrees to be a fake girlfriend or fake fiance for the rich landlord of her building, and of course, she shows up at his house for Christmas, and the girl she had that great night with is there. It's his sister. So it's sort of a predictable romantic comedy setup, but Alison Cochrun does great things with it. It's just a really sweet story. And it does a lot as well with sort of mental health issues and getting over them, learning to cope with them and adapt and open yourself up to the possibility of failure, opening yourself up to the possibility of being hurt. I enjoy that. So it was a great book. The next one is the first that I actually have a copy of. It's Infinite Country by Patricia Engel. This was actually something I had started the year before in 2021 and didn't finish. and had wanted to circle back to. So I managed to circle back to it this year. The writing in this is great. I feel like this is the book that people should read instead of American Dirt by Janine Cummins, which not a great book at all. It was one of my least favorite reads from 2021, I believe. This is a great book, really well written. It's a slim little thing. You could dunk it in your coffee. And I think I ultimately listened to the audio, but I really enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to what Patricia Engel does next. And stay tuned for that, because I will be talking about it when I talk about my most anticipated books of 2023. So this is the story of an immigrant family and their experience being undocumented, and it's about their family and to have them try to stay together. It's a really beautiful, beautifully written book, and again, a slim little thing that you could fit in anytime you want, if you would like to. The next one is Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin. This was, I think, the first book I finished in 2022. It was sort of a carryover from 2021. I think I had started it at the end of 2021 and it carried over across the year. I liked it, not as much as the other James Baldwin books that I have read. This is sort of a more personal story for him. It's almost autobiographical. And it's his first novel. And I love the way it is described, where like this is the book he had to write in order to get past all of the issues of his upbringing so he could focus on other things. You do sort of sense that it is his debut novel. Later works of his that I have read are a little more strong, but it's still a fantastic book. You really can't go wrong with James Baldwin. This is a beautiful, beautifully written book. But again, just because it's not as strong as the other James Baldwins that I've read, it falls into almost best and not best. The next one is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. And the reason this is almost best and not best is that there are two halves to the story. There are two different narratives. One is the story of a female pilot in the early 1900s, kind of Amelia Earhart-esque. It's her story of her childhood and how she gets into becoming a pilot and the sort of burning desire she has for adventure and how that goes against what she is being taught is proper for a woman to do, and how she pursues her passion anyway. And ultimately, like Amelia Earhart, she disappears without a trace and is never found. So half of the book, or one narrative, is her storyline as she grows up, becomes a pilot, and ultimately leading up to her disappearance and what may or may not have happened to her. The other storyline is contemporary, and it is where an actress is cast to play her, that pilot, in a movie about her life. And I liked the storyline about the pilot. I did not like the contemporary one as much. I do think that ultimately Maggie Shipstead uses the contemporary storyline to add some resonance to the older storyline, but there's no denying that every time a chapter ended and I was going back to the contemporary storyline, part of me was kind of like, oh, here we go. Okay. Had to kind of brace myself to work into it. Still liked it, but that definitely keeps it from being one of my best reads. That's why it's an almost best. And I would still recommend it. It is a long audio. I listened to the audio of it, but it was a great book. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and had a really great awards run. And I caught up to it when that was already over. But I would recommend it. It's just, take that grain of salt that I offered, where I really just like one of the two storylines. And I do think that the second storyline, the one I did not like, ultimately adds something, but your mileage may vary. The next book that I want to talk about is Stories from the Tenants Downstairs by Sidik Fofana. This is another really short book. I listened to it on audio. I think the audio is about 4 hours. And it is a really great collection of stories that are kind of linked because they're all about tenants of a single building that is experiencing gentrification in its neighborhood. So Sidik Fofana wanted to write about gentrification without writing about the things that you would typically think of or reach out for. He really just wanted to tell the stories of the people because nobody really has one experience of it. Nobody really wakes up in the morning in his neighborhood. He said this in an NPR interview. He's like, I don't think anybody wakes up and thinks, oh no, what am I going to do about gentrification? They go about their lives and they face unique and individual problems to them that are impacted by the larger things that are going on. And I thought that was a really smart way to structure the collection. the personalities of the characters really shine through. There are different narrators for each chapter, and one thing I definitely give Sidik Fofana credit for is that he manages to make every character have a different and unique voice. And that is something that is altogether too rare, I think, in fiction, because a lot of the time you'll read a story collection or a book with a lot of characters who sort of share the narrative, and they all sound exactly the same. That is not the case with this book, and I think that is commendable for Sidik Fofana. But again, your mileage may vary, because you might get to a story where you don't like this particular character, you don't like their point of view. To me, that's almost the point, because you're not going to like every person that you meet. But I think Joel read this, and there was one character who was like, oh, wow. So take that into consideration. I really liked it. It was a successful book for me. It just didn't ultimately crack into my best of the year, and it is what it is. Then we have The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty, and this is the book that won the National Book Award for Fiction last year, and I listened to it on audio. What I usually say about it is it's an interesting experience. I had a hard time getting into the audio because it feels very slow, and the narration of the book, there are different narrators, one of which is actually Tess Gunty. She takes the majority of the narrative. Sounds bored, but as you work your way through the book, I started noticing that it just, the attitude, this sort of slowness, the lackadaisical quality of the prose kind of mirrors the depression that the characters are feeling. There are a lot of characters in this book. Again, kind of like Tenants, Stories from the Tenants Downstairs, it's about people living in a particular apartment complex, and it's about the history of that apartment complex. It's sort of like an ensemble of characters. However, there is definitely a protagonist, and there are sort of religious overtones to the book, but not really heavily, if that's a thing that you don't appreciate. She is sort of obsessed with women who sort of became martyred, essentially, and who were tortured for their beliefs. But she is a foster child. She lives with 3 foster children they've all aged out of the system, and they're trying to make a go of it in the world, and they are struggling in different ways and similar ways, but they are trying to hold on to each other for connection. They are trying to find connection with other people. They're trying to find grace in the world, biblically, and just in terms of forgiveness and understanding and acceptance that they have not gotten in their lives. There are other people in the complex, and I think ultimately there are a little too many characters in the book, but it ends up being a pretty staggering and haunting story about people and economic disparity and how hard it is to get by. And it's a very American story as well. I totally understand why the National Book Award selected it as their fiction winner for last year, despite a couple of quibbles on my part. But it is a haunting novel. It is something that I still think about. And I think I read it in October, so it's been a couple months at this point. And I'll probably will be thinking about it for a time to come. So it was definitely successful in that regard. This was in my favorite books for a long time in 2022, and then it fell out toward the end of the year. It's Elena Knows by Claudia Piñeiro, translated by Francis Riddle. This was, I believe, shortlisted for the Booker International Prize last year. Ultimately, it did not win. It's another slim little volume. This is a very devastating book. It's kind of difficult to read because it deals with grief and anger at loss, and also it deals with a character who has a debilitating medical condition that has been degrading her health and her ability to move around for a long time. So in addition to her grief, she is struggling with her own body, and she has lost her daughter. She does not believe that it was suicide, as the police have labeled it, and she has been unable to get the police to care or to investigate into what she sees as a crime. So she times her medication schedule so that she can get into the city, and she's going on one last-ditch attempt to try to convince someone to help her and advocate for her and her daughter. And you can tell right there, it's a very heavy book. It packs a huge punch. It can be difficult because it is very emotional, because the things that she faces are very serious. but it's a very well-written book, and it is brimming with anger, a sort of palpable anger and frustration and a rage and a sorrow in a really beautiful way. I think it just happened that 2022 was a very competitive year for my best list, and it just narrowly got pushed off. But I do definitely love it. I have heard people who don't respond to it, and I'm sure a lot of that has to do with the really heavy subject matter of this book, and the bristly character of the protagonist and the dark conclusions that the book comes to. But I enjoyed it, and I know a couple of other people have enjoyed it as well. So I would recommend it if you can stomach it. The next book was a total surprise for me. It's The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. So my niece was assigned very loose summer reading goals from her school, and she used to be a big reader, but she is not right now. She's also 13, and she's kind of in that phase where, she's a teenager now all of a sudden and trying to figure out a lot of things. So my sister and I conspired and came up with a plan to have my niece and I buddy read this book. She ultimately didn't finish it, but we had a great conversation about the first half of the book, and I ended up loving it. We had gone through a list of books that we could read together, and this was the one that she ultimately selected. I had seen the animated movie adaptation of this book as a child, and it terrified me. So I was a little nervous about going into this book. I wasn't convinced that the quality was going to be really good. The writing of this book is gorgeous. It is a fantasy novel. Obviously, it is about a last unicorn. If you're unfamiliar, so unicorns in this world are solitary creatures. So this unicorn has been living in the woods by herself, surrounded by other animals, obviously, but no unicorns for a long time. And she sees two men who are hunters and overhears them saying that no one has seen unicorns. So they see evidence of her inhabitation of this forest, and they say, well, it can't be because nobody's seen the unicorns. They don't exist anymore. And she just gets curious, so she wanders out, and it turns out all the unicorns, except for her, have vanished from the world. And she's trying to find out what may or have happened to them, where they may have gone. And that journey involves a magician named Schmendrick, and takes her to of course, a cursed castle where there is a red bull. And it's a really great, beautiful, beautiful story. Even the first paragraph, I would say, of this book is really gorgeous. The writing is fantastic, and I would absolutely recommend it. It was a big surprise for me. I was not really thinking I was going to like it as much as I did. This is another book that spent a long time on my favorites list and then got steadily pushed down as more great reads piled in there. So it's almost best, but I really did enjoy it, and I think there's a good chance that you would as well. Next is another heavy book. Nightcrawling, of course, heavy in terms of subject matter, not like literally heavy, by Leila Mottley. This was longlisted for the Booker Prize and did not make the shortlist. It was a good shortlist this year. I enjoyed this book. I would have loved to see it. This is a debut novel from a 19-year-old, which is stunning. And I think there are some ways where you can tell that this is a debut novel, but it is really beautifully put together, beautifully written, sharply observed. It is based on things that Leila Mottley saw going on in Oakland when she was a teenager, and that's sad enough. But it is about a girl who is a teenager in Oakland, and who her parents are out of the picture. Her father is dead. Her mother is in a sort of halfway house as she's gotten out of prison, and she has been left with her brother. The brother is now chasing this sort of pipe dream of rap superstardom. So she is left to take care of both of them. And she is faced with a rent increase that she is not going to be able to pay. And she starts walking the streets at night. And this leads her to fall into the crosshairs of the Oakland Police Department. And they begin to take terrible advantage of her. In terms of violence, in terms of sexual assault, it's terrible. And of course, because they are the police, she has nowhere to go and nothing that she can do about it. It's a very heavy book. but it is achingly beautiful and a really good book. It just, again, it was a really competitive year for my favorite reads. So this is another one that was originally on it when my best of 2022, when I first read it, and then it just slowly got edged out by some other books. But it is a great book if you can stomach what it is about. And then we have Winter Love by Han Suyin. The cover of this book reflects light a lot, so I'm going to try to find a way to hold it so you can see the cover, which is pretty beautiful. So this is another slim little novel. I listened to the audio when we traveled to Italy, and we were actually coming home at that point. And I didn't know that this was written in the 1960s. And when I got to the end of the book and it said copyright 1960 whatever, I was stunned. I had really thought that it was a contemporary novel set in the sort of World War II, in the post-World War II era in the UK. And it really uses that setting to staggering effect. It talks about the rationing a lot. That's sort of a subtle theme going on in the background of the book. And that sense of deprivation that you get from that and from this sort of austere setting in the UK after World War II and all the devastation that happened and the bombings that happened really ties in with the main plot, which is about two young women who meet in college and fall in love, but who are not able to be together because it's not accepted in popular society at the time. And it is a short but devastating book. It definitely gave me vibes of Patricia Highsmith's The Price of Salt, which was later renamed Carol and which inspired the movie Carol, because it also really deals with the psychology of these characters, especially the protagonist, and how she gets very frustrated and she will lash out at the people she loves and cares about when she does, in very cruel ways. And it's very interesting from that perspective. So I really enjoyed this book, and I hope more people will discover it because I thought it was just absolutely fantastic. I have two more books to talk about, and the next to last one is Agatha of Little Neon by Claire Luchette. This was another book that I read very early in 2022, and one that I've really spent a lot of time thinking about, and which I talked about in my video about books that I hope more people will discover that I read in 2022. I'll link that video down below as well. It is about a group of nuns who are in a convent in, I believe, Pennsylvania. I could be wrong, maybe upstate New York. And they run a school. And their order is shut down. So they are relocated to a halfway house in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. This halfway house is nicknamed Little Neon because it is painted this sort of violent shade of green. And the protagonist is a nun. She has been very sheltered intentionally in her life as a nun. She hasn't really questioned it, but now that they've relocated, she begins to spend some time on her own. She gets a job, which had been sort of unheard of before, but a local school needs help teaching math, geometry, I believe. And she is taken on by the school to do that. So she gets out of the house, she gets away from the other nuns a little bit, and she spends more time with her own thoughts. She meets kids who are trying to figure out who they are, and she begins to question her world and where it's going, what she wants. She questions her faith. She questions what she wanted when she joined the order in the first place and what she might be hiding from in herself. It's a really sharp and beautiful book. It's also a very quiet book, so I can definitely see how someone might read this and think like not much is happening, but I found it achingly beautiful as well. And I really enjoyed it. It's a book that has sat with me for a year now, and a book that I think will continue to sit with me for a long time. So I definitely recommend it to you. And then the final book that I'm putting on my almost best is Didn't Nobody Give a Shoot? What Happens to Carlotta by James Hannaham. This is a book that I listened to on audio, and the audio production is fantastic. I can't quite imagine, it's so good that I can't quite imagine how it would work in text. Someday I would love to see a copy of the book to see, because the way it works is there's one narrator of the audiobook who does the strict narration of the book. He tells you, it takes you from point A to B and tells you everything that happened. And there's another narrator who voices Carlotta, who sort of interjects along the way. and occasionally will read Carlotta's dialogue and will occasionally just take the narration a little bit just to tell a story and things like that. It's a really well done audio. I imagine it works on the page as well, but the audio production is really great. And so Carlotta is released from prison on parole. Most of the book takes place on the first full day after her release. Carlotta is a transgender Black woman who has been in prison for 20 years for a crime that they didn't really have much to do. They were sort of accidentally an accessory to a crime, and they went away for 20 years. And now she has gotten out and is returned home to New York and has to deal with suddenly finding herself back out in the world when she's lived in this very rigid and controlled environment for a long time. She is faced again with the family that has not known her since she began to transition to being a woman, and has to deal with misgendering, misnaming, and all of that stuff. Has to deal with an almost cruel and unrealistic set of rules and regulations for her parole that she has to live by, and a lot of casual cruelty and racism and things like that. And it is a book that does a very good job putting you in Carlotta's minds and helping you experience what the world would be like for her. And I think it's very beautiful from that perspective. So I would absolutely recommend it. So those are the books that I would say are my almost best, the sort of honorable mentions. And there are great books here. I do have some quibbles with some of them, but by and large, these are great books that I think you couldn't go wrong trying for yourself. And if you have read them, I'd love to hear your thoughts about them. If you have recommendations based on them for things that you think I would like, I'd love to hear them down below as well. So as always, I appreciate your time. Thank you for that. And I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.